Hey everyone, I haven't been too active and haven't released a new video in a few weeks, but I will try to get a bit more consistent again. And as most of you know, I have been a big fan of Minimal Audio's plugins, especially their synthesizer current, of course, but also all the other plugins that they have released. And they've been adding more effects to current and also then started to release them as standalone plugins. And they have just recently released the wave shifter effect as a standalone plugin. And so I just wanted to show you how I like to use the effect outside of current. Big advantage there is, of course, that you can use it on audio tracks, on groups. And so having this as a standalone effect just gives you quite a bit more flexibility as opposed to just having it as an effect within current. So I mainly use it as a frequency shifter. They have different styles there, the ring mod and the amp modulation as well. But for what I typically use it for, the frequency shifting just works best. So let's just set this to 100% wet. One of the main parameters, of course, that I'm mainly using is the frequency here. We can already just play around with this one and see how it affects the sound. So you can already change the sound quite drastically there. And so this gets a bit more interesting once I start adding the feedback here. And there's for each sound, so depending on what kind of sound you're using as a source, you will find that there are various sweet spots for specific sounds. And you will hear what I'm talking about once I start adding the feedback here. So as you can hear now with the feedback added, the frequency setting there is really sensitive, so minimal adjustments can drastically change the sound. And usually if you go a bit too far down or too far up, you lose a lot of low end and overall a lot of information and the sound gets kind of washed out too much, which can be cool if you're going for this effect. But I really like this bubbly sound that still has quite a bit of low end and also a bit of punch, of course, depending on the source sample, but you can hear the differences easily here. And so once you start going up a bit more with the feedback, you need to be a bit careful with this. So if you're playing around with something like this, then they have a limiter in there, but I'm also just gonna add Pro L at the end here. These two knobs alone, the frequency and the feedback, can give you a wide variety of sounds. I really like this to create source elements, just assets for user interface sounds, any like futuristic sound effects. This is a really nice way to create assets for those. Something that I think a lot of people might be ignoring is this feedback time knob here, because this again can quite drastically change the sound as well. So yeah, if you go too far there, the sound gets washed out a lot. If you're playing around with time stretching a lot with different algorithms, depending on what kind of DAW you're using, then I'm sure you have probably heard similar effects to this one. And then if you want to, you can modulate everything a bit more and bring movement into it. But I have this modulation section there. If I use this, then it's in a really subtle way, because I don't really like to have this big movement. It's just very chaotic. And for the sounds that I typically create, I need a bit more control, because I mainly use this to create short assets, and so I usually appreciate to have a bit more control over everything. So as opposed to using the modulation here, I typically just draw an automation with this. But if you have a longer file, this can give you really crazy effects as well. This still preserves the movement, the character of the original sound. So if I would place a different sound in there with a different movement, it wouldn't sound exactly the same as this. Because if you go too crazy with a lot of these settings here, eventually whatever you put in as a source material doesn't really matter that much anymore, and everything is going to sound very similar. Which is also why I like to just dial in the settings specific to whatever source sound I'm using, because otherwise I could just use anything and just go crazy with the settings there. And so I also really like to use this on shorter sounds that are a bit more punchy and have a clearer transient. So something very simple like this. And we can also now dial this in to get a very specific sound. So as you can hear, if I go above the 0 Hertz, then I get this kind of bubbly effect. And if I just go a bit below 0 Hertz, then it gives it a bit more punch and a bit more low end. And so this allows me to get really interesting variations of these short impact sounds. And if I increase the feedback, of course, then it's gonna change a bit more drastically. Having something like this, let's say you like the character of this now, then of course I would just continue processing this bit of multiband compression on there. We can also use some more saturation and transient shaping. Let's just use a good old trusty Trans X and put the limiter at the end again. And then you could even go in there, use another instance of this. And then maybe get some more interesting variations out of this. Something that I'll also like using sometimes is this FM section here. So if we turn up the amount here, you're gonna hear what it does. Again, something that I like to use in a more subtle way. It's also very interesting to play around with the ratio here. And especially when modulating the frequency here and using the frequency modulation there, you can also get easily these very typical anime sound effects. So if you put, for example, a reverb in front of this instance here, you get this modulated tremolo movement in there. So if you're looking to create source sounds for these kinds of sound effects, then this is also a really interesting technique. So I hope that this short video was helpful and maybe gave you some ideas of how you can use an effect like this. Right, so take care.